Okay, so now we have to go ahead and look at groups. So let's do a deep dive into groups. And for this, I'll duplicate my file and create a consumer demo groups. And so now in this file, what am I going to change? Well, we are going to play with this group ID. So first of all, even though we have earliest, as I said before, this is equivalent to the from beginning option from the CLI. If I run this code again, if I just run it right now, it will not show me anything. That's because our consumer group has already been started and it's been reading all the way up until the end. We can verify that using the Kafka consumer groups command. And so from it, let's just find the right commands. It's bootstrap server localhost 9092. The group is my fourth, so I'll write correctly, fourth application, and we'll do a describe on it. So using this, we can see that we are at the current offset, which is equal to the log end offsets. So we have 0 of lag. So obviously, if you wanted to restart your application to read from the beginning, you either have to reset the group ID, or, as we've done before, or you just make the group ID change. And I'll say it's my fifth application, so my fifth. Now, obviously, if I restart my application right here, so I'll just stop this one in the bottom, I'll stop everything, and I restart my application, we should be seeing all the messages again flow in. As we can see, we have received all these messages right here. So it all looks good. So by changing the group ID, you basically reset an application. So that's a way of doing it. Now, the interesting thing that I want to show you is rebalances. So remember that before we had demonstrated in using the CLI that by starting 3 consumers with the same group ID, there was some rebalance. I want to show you that this also happens in this. So let's exit let's clear this window, so we can do trash here and it clears the window. And what I'm going to do is start a second consumer. So I'll start a second consumer right here. And as we can see, we have first consumer running and second consumer running. But if we look at the log, there's been some log being created. And so if we go, there's an abstract coordinator and a consumer coordinator, and I go all the way to the right-hand side, and it says attempt to heartbeat fail since the group is rebalancing. So because we started a second consumer, the group started rebalancing. And so previously, the assigned partitions for that first consumer was partition 0, partition 1, and partition 2. But because it rejoined the group, it had the newly assigned partitions, which is just partition 0 and just partition 1. While this one right here, who just joined that I just started, at the right-hand side, it says, hey, I'm rejoining the group, and now the assigned partitions for me is just partition 2. So now we know through the Java code, we have a little bit more information. We can see that the first consumer has 2 partitions now, and the second consumer has the last partition. So if we go ahead and run the producer demo, for example, in the third line, so the demo has been run, okay? Basically what we can see is that, well, I have to launch the right one. So I launched producer demo, but the one that sends a lot of data is, for example, producer demo keys. So I'll run this one instead. Okay, so this one has sent a lot of data. So what we can see is that consumer demo, the first one, okay, groups, reads from partition 0 and partition 1. So we can see that all the partitions right here is 0 and 1, while the second one only reads from partition 2, which is exactly the assignment that they get right here, so setting newly assigned partitions. And so what happens if I start a third consumer? So let's start a third consumer. Let me clear the screen right here. So I'll clear the screen so we can really look at the log as it happens. So I start a third consumer. So now we have a third consumer started. So the first consumer right here just gets some log and it says, okay, I'm revoking my previously assigned partitions, partition 0 and 1. I'm rejoining the group, and now I'm only going to deal with partition 0. The second consumer says, okay, same thing. I'm only going to deal with partition 1. Before I was just partition 2, but now after the rebalance, I'm partition 1. And the third one said, all right, sounds good. I just joined. I'm going to be partition 2. So now basically, if I run again my producer demo keys, then what we see is that the first consumer only receives partition 0. The second consumer only receives partition 1. And the third consumer only receives partition 2. but now we made it obvious. We really saw that with the consumer coordinator, we basically have these rebalances happening during the logs. So this log is super useful to understand when the rebalances happen, etc., etc., etc. And so that's about it. Now, if you were to stop this consumer, for example, so I'm just going to make it exit right here, then after a few, basically the consumers are going to detect that this consumer is down, and this will happen very shortly. So because the consumer get disconnected, we get here some log, the coordinator, and says, okay, there's been a group rebalance that needs to happen because something just got dropped. And so this one got 2 partitions as the result, and this one got a new partition as a result again. And if you stop this one, it's a fun demo to do. I'll stop this one as well. Then after a while, this one will detect that everyone is down but him. And so basically what will happen is that there will be newly assigned partitions, which is going to be partition 0, partition 1, and as we can see now, partition 2. And so you can play around with these groups, creating new consumers and destroying them and stuff. But with this demo, we basically looked at the fact that the data is rebalancing and the consumers are rebalancing if they're part of the same group every time a consumer comes up and the consumer comes down, which is really, really helpful. So in the next lecture, we're going to look at how to properly code a consumer because this while true right here is not very nice.